I'm Ian Fletcher. If you'd like more information about the topics discussed in this video, please take a look at my book with Mark Fastow, Industrial Policy for the United States, Winning the Competition for Good Jobs and High-Value Industries. Our website is at www.industrialpolicy.us. If you're like most Americans, you probably grew up with the myth that technological innovation is something that comes from the private sector. You know the myth. Some lone genius in his garage in Palo Alto founds a company and becomes a millionaire. But the reality is that government was actually responsible for a lot of the most important innovations since World War II. This isn't to disparage the role of private innovators, but it does mean that to understand how innovation really works, we have to get beyond the myth and look at the real history. Let's start with passenger aviation, beginning with the jet engine, without which airlines as we know them would not exist. During World War II, the U.S. Army Air Force arranged transfer of jet engine technology, originally invented in Britain, to General Electric. Several firms, including GE, Westinghouse, Pratt & Whitney, and Lockheed, received federal funding to develop jet engines. The first American jet engine, the 1A, was developed by GE in 1942. The next crucial innovation was the turbofan. The first one was built in 1956 by Pratt & Whitney using components from the military J-57 and J-75 engines. Next came powerful, fuel-efficient, high-bypass turbofans, without which wide-body jetliners would not be possible. These were initially developed for the giant military transport plane, the C-5, which is still in use today. The Air Force spent over $30 million on the Pratt & Whitney JTF-14 engine, from which developed the JT-9D used on the legendary Boeing 747, which was for several decades the largest plane in the world. Boeing got to be the dominant plane builder in the US, and for many years the whole world, precisely because it got a giant military head start on building giant airliners. The company got crucial experience building the world's first large jet plane, the B-47 bomber, and then the giant nuclear-armed B-52 that debuted in 1955 and is still in service. In the 1950s, when most planes were still the smaller, slower turboprops, the airlines began asking Boeing for a passenger jet. About the same time, the Air Force was also seeking a new jet-powered flying tanker to service its new jet fighters. Therefore, Boeing built a prototype, the 367-80, with both uses in mind, and the civilian 707 and the military KC-135 tanker were both subsequently derived from it. The 707 is what really ushered in the age of mass air travel. It first flew in 1957, and its first engines were the same J-57s as on the B-52. The 707's flight controls derived from those of the B-47 and the B-52, and its autopilot and, in later models, its inertial navigation system were also based on military designs. On the strength of the profits and technical knowledge from the 707, Boeing subsequently developed a whole family of aircraft of different sizes and ranges. Even today, engine cores are frequently designed for both military and civilian uses, and engine controls are often identical. Many key technological innovations, such as thrust reversers, airplanes' brakes, were initially developed for the military. Now let's look at smartphones. The smartphones of today were made possible by multiple accumulated decades of federally funded innovations. Their resistive touchscreens were invented in 1971 at the University of Kentucky by George Hurst as an accidental byproduct of his work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The first screen that could register multiple touches at once was created in 1984 by Bob Boyd at Labs, and in 1999, full multi-touch functionality was developed with National Science Foundation funding by Wayne Westerman and John Elias at the University of Delaware. Smartphones' complementary metal oxide semiconductor image sensors were invented in 1992 at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech during work on cameras for satellites. Smartphones' thin-film transistor LCD displays descend in part from work done at Westinghouse in the 1970s with Army funding. Smartphones' lithium-ion batteries were made possible by the invention of lithium cobalt oxide cathode materials by John Goodenough in 1980 at Oxford in England. Later, at the University of Texas, with funding from the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy, he discovered less expensive materials, making these batteries practical. The Advanced Photon Source at the Department of Energy's Argonne National Lab outside Chicago then allowed scientists to better understand the reactions that take place inside an NIMH battery, enabling a safer, cheaper, high-capacity, more durable version. Smartphone's GPS is a spin-off from the military. This system was created by and is still operated by the Air Force. Its first prototype satellite was launched in 1978 as part of a military-only system known as Navstar. This opened to the public in 1983 with less accuracy than for military users, and then in Y2K, civilian users were granted the same 10-meter accuracy. Now let's look at the Internet, because the Internet, despite the billions of dollars made on it, was not invented to make a profit. During the first phase of the Internet's development, which lasted from about 1960 to 1970, computer networking itself was invented. One key innovation was packet switching, which breaks up messages into so-called packets that can travel by separate routes for reassembly at their destination. This was invented by Paul Barron at America's Rand Corporation and Donald Davies at Britain's National Physical Laboratory, funded by their respective governments. The first version of the Internet, called ARPANET, was funded by the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, the legendary DARPA. One key step in the development of the Internet was the invention of Transmission Control Protocol/Internet Protocol, commonly known as TCP/IP, which was invented by Vinton Cerf and Bob Kahn with DARPA funding. Two other key technologies of the World Wide Web are Hypertext Markup Language, which specifies how its pages are written, and Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which specifies how they're transmitted. Both were developed by the Englishman Tim Berners-Lee, who was working in Switzerland at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, which is funded by 23 European governments. The first commercially available web browser, Mosaic, was developed by Mark Andreessen, a grad student at the University of Illinois, working at its National Science Foundation-sponsored National Center for Supercomputer Applications. HTTPS, which is necessary for secure e-commerce, is based on public key encryption. This concept was initially invented at Britain's GCHQ spy agency in 1970, but it was kept secret and not used due to the limited computing power of the day. It was reinvented and elaborated into a usable technology in 1977 at MIT by Ronald Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard Edelman. They were not directly supported by government for this specific project, but National Science Foundation grants funded their lab, a key form of indirect government support. Google was created by Stanford computer science grad students Sergey Brin and Larry Page while working on the Stanford Digital Library project in 1996. This project, funded mainly by the National Science Foundation, but also by DARPA, NASA, and corporate partners, aimed to develop a universal digital library. Now let's look at nuclear power, which is becoming more appreciated lately due to its ability to generate carbon-free electricity. All of American nuclear technology ultimately derives from the famous Manhattan Project, the World War II effort to build the atomic bomb. Nuclear reactors that generate electricity rather than fissionable materials for weapons were developed after the war thanks in large part to legislation such as the 1954 Atomic Energy Act. In 1955, the Atomic Energy Commission began its power reactor demonstration program, in which it partnered with private companies to develop the first nuclear power plants. Between 1954 and 1962, the federal government spent $1.3 billion and private industry $500 million developing reactor technology for civilian use. The first commercial nuclear plant in the U.S. opened in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh in 1958. Optimism about nuclear technology ran so high in those days that some predicted that nuclear-generated electricity would be, quote, too cheap to meter. Government has supported development of other green technologies too. For example, Bell Labs produced the first photovoltaic cells for government satellites starting in 1954. For decades, solar cells' cost per kilowatt was too high for them to be a practical source of electric power for the grid. So, in 2011, the Department of Energy announced its Sunshot initiative, aiming at a 75% reduction by decade's end. Sunshot met 90% of its original goal in only 5 years, so in 2016, a new initiative, Sunshot 2030, was launched, aiming at a further 50% reduction by 2030. In 2019, a new world record for efficiency, 47%, was set by cells developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Now let's look at wind power. Thanks largely to federal support, the cost of wind-generated electricity fell 90% from 1980 to 2000. During the 1980s, government funded a big science push by NASA and the Department of Energy for large high-tech wind turbines. It was relatively unsuccessful, in part because it was detached from the private sector's operational experience. But the department also made another effort focused on component innovations for smaller turbines and drawing on manufacturers to inform its research agenda. This effort succeeded, producing such key innovations as twisted blades and special-purpose airfoils. All in all, government helped fund 7 of the era's 12 major advances. Government has even supported the development of old, dirty energy technologies like fracking. It has long been known that shale rock throughout the country contains plentiful, albeit hard to extract, natural gas, and shale was first fracked in 1965. But economically feasible fracking at scale, sufficient to turn the U.S. by 2019 into a net petroleum exporter for the first time in 75 years, was only achieved after decades of public and private research into a whole package of new technologies, including fracking itself, horizontal drilling, microseismic imaging, and underground mapping. During the 1970s, federal efforts included the Energy Research and Development Administration's Eastern Gas Shales Project, begun in 1976, which carried out demonstration projects with universities and drilling companies. The Department of Energy's National Energy Technology Laboratory helped develop key fracking technologies, including foam fracturing, oriented coring, fractographic analysis, and large volume hydraulic fracturing. In 1977, it first successfully demonstrated massive hydraulic fracturing in shale. Working with a private company, Mitchell Energy, it drilled the first horizontal shale well and extracted gas. Key fracking technologies came from outside the petroleum industry. For example, the underground mapping required to find the oil and gas came from unrelated research into geothermal energy. Finally, consider biotechnology. Biotech is based upon recombinant DNA technology, which enables transplantation of genes from one organism to another. This was first achieved in 1973 by Herbert Boyer at the University of California at San Francisco and Stanley Cohen at Stanford, both supported by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Soon, NIH was funding over 100 biotech projects. Viewing the field as likely to yield progress against cancer, by 1987, it had invested over $100 million. Between 1995 and 2008, the NIH's total funding nearly tripled, from $11 billion to $29 billion, with a huge impact on biotech. 13 of the 15 American-developed blockbuster, that is, over $1 billion in annual sales, biotech drugs received federal support for their discovery, development, or clinical trials. For 8 of these, the government either funded university research or NIH scientists made the key discoveries. Let's talk for a second about the implications of this series of technological achievements we've just looked at. The big question, obviously, is why government can achieve certain innovations that the private sector can't or just hasn't. Everyone understands that pure science is a public good, but apparently so is applied science in some cases, that is, technology. So why is this? Well, the first thing is that some ideas are too fundamental to patent or make a trade secret or do something else to them that would enable a private entity to make a profit and therefore have an incentive to create the invention. For example, you can certainly patent the specific technologies that the internet is based on, but the idea of a worldwide publicly accessible computer network, no, you can't patent that. In any case, do we really want, say, Microsoft owning something as important as the entire internet, which is what you would get if you did have recourse to a purely private sector model for a technology like that? The closest analogy to that would be something like the old AT&T, which did own the entire US phone system and was a closely government-regulated entity for decades, but that's kind of a second-best solution. Another reason why public sector can achieve certain innovations the private sector can't is that government can fund technologies that are themselves difficult to monetize, but which serve as enablers or platforms for technologies that can be monetized. And once again, the classic contemporary example is the internet. Also, some time horizons are just too long. If you look at how many decades of science and technological development it took to achieve some of these products, you can't go to a VC with an idea that's going to take 20 years to pay off and expect them to invest in what you want to do. But government agencies can invest in basically infinite time horizons, and they also have the ability to recoup the cost from expanding the tax base of the entire economy, even if the benefits of some technology are going to be so widely distributed and often difficult to track down that it's very hard to say, okay, this is where this technology came from, you made money off this, and now you owe me a slice. Another point is that some green technologies, for example, aren't necessarily valuable because they're profitable. They serve other social needs like environmental protection, and public health and national security also fall into this category. And it's no accident that a number of the inventions we just looked at are related to either energy or came out of the national security industrial complex.